I want to welcome you all. It's so great to be with you. This is our spring lecture of the Ada Maria Isasi-Diaz Justice Institute. The Charter Oak started in 2022. And we're thrilled to have Reverend Dr. Kenia Mendoza with us tonight to deliver the lecture. It's just a pleasure and an honor to have her with us. So just a couple of things before we begin. Those of you who've been to these lectures before have heard all this before, so you can go get a cookie. The Charter Oak Cultural Center is a multicultural arts center, and we do the work of social justice through the arts. Our City School of the Arts provides a free arts education to 1,000 Hartford children who otherwise probably would not be able to enjoy that kind of exposure to and immersion in the arts. We offer 3 programs for people in the unsheltered community that offer employment and educational opportunities. And we present professional multicultural arts events from which no one is ever turned away for lack of funds. So please, I want to invite you to sign up for our e-blasts, because they're not just a list of our events coming up, which is interesting in and of itself, but there's a lot of substantive material in our e-blasts. And if you're inspired by our work, I wanted to invite you to consider making a donation to Charter Oak. Every dollar is important, especially during this time when the need is so great and costs are so high. Now about tonight. So we began the Ada Maria Isasi-Diaz Justice Institute, as I said, in 2022 to honor the work of Dr. Isasi-Diaz, the creator of Mujerista Theology, and in her name to give a platform for Latinx women, scholars, theologians, and activists to bring their work to the public square. And tonight, again, we are so honored to have the opportunity to learn from Reverend Dr. Kenia Mendoza. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Mendoza. She was born in La Paz, Bolivia, and raised in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from American University before attending American University Washington College of Law in 2006. And after graduating from law school, she devoted herself to the practice of immigration law with a particular focus on deportation defense within the Latina community. After 7 years in legal practice, Kenia Vanessa was baptized at a Protestant church in Springfield, Virginia. This experience led her to pursue a Master of Divinity from Wesley Theological Seminary, and she now serves as senior minister at the same church where she was baptized. Her ministry experience inspired her to continue her academic journey through doctoral studies in Christian ethics. There's nothing that this woman cannot do. This should be clear at this point. On May 15th, 2026, she graduated from Drew University with a PhD in Christian social ethics. Her work focuses on the lived experiences of Latinas and their communities through a Mujerista ethical critique. Kenia Vanessa is deeply passionate about empowering and affirming Latinas so that God's liberative and transformative work may be witnessed for all. It is such a pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mendoza. I was at her, I had the honor of being at her dissertation defense. I was there on Zoom, and it is clear that she is a brilliant scholar and teacher. And so we are so honored to have her with us tonight. Dr. Mendoza.
Thank you so much, Donna. Good evening to everyone. Buenas noches. I would like to start off by thanking Donna for the invitation to share this space with you all tonight as part of Charter Oak's Ada Maria Isasi-Diaz Justice Institute. It's a true honor to be here this evening. Donna shared that I will have about 45 minutes to present, and then we'll open it up for Q&A for about 15 minutes. But to be honest with you, that's a lot of time. As a pastor, I usually preach 12 to 15 minutes at most. As a lawyer, my arguments are direct and concise. And during my recent dissertation defense, I only had 15 minutes to present 5 chapters that I wrote to my committee. So these 45 minutes might be a challenge, but I'm excited to be here and excited to open the space for our conversation after. Tonight, I will share the construction of what I call Mujerista Aliviar ethics, which is heavily reliant on Isasi-Diaz's Mujerista theology, as well as Latina Chicana feminist theory and decolonial thought. Let me share my PowerPoint. Here is a sample agenda to provide a bit of an outline for tonight's presentation. I will start off by locating self to provide context. Then I will share a few key pillars of Mujerista theology that are relevant to my research. And thus my goal is not to teach Mujerista theology tonight, but to touch on some important facets. Then I will share a few sentences about my dissertation and one of my findings to provide context in how it helped me to then construct Mujerista Aliviar ethics in the concluding chapter of my dissertation. In Ada Maria Isasi-Diaz's book, Mujerista Theology, A Theology for the 21st Century, she divides the book into two parts. The first part is locating self in Mujerista theology, and the second is doing Mujerista theology. Why is locating self so important? Because we recognize and name that when we present or do research, share thoughts or opinions, theories, it's always with our subjectivity. And thus, as Isasi-Diaz says, we distrust anyone who claims to possess objectivity. Along those lines, I recognize that I am not ahistorical or apolitical or neutral. I won't share all aspects of my social location, but two that I find significantly influenced my research. First, I was born in Bolivia and came to the US when I was 3. I remember growing up in school here in the US, where I realized early on that in order to succeed, I had to memorize everything the teachers taught me and accept it as true. Then I had to repeat it on exams, which then meant I was learning. And if I did not memorize, or worse, did not agree, I was not learning. So there was very early on instilled in me this understanding that somehow I was an empty vessel, that I needed to be filled by what teachers taught me in their power and position as teachers. That type of memorizing got me through college. But when I started graduate school, I had to start applying some reasoning to what I was memorizing. In law school, I had to argue what would a reasonable person do in certain circumstances using the letter of the law, as they say. And so in those arguments, I did use some of my experience, perspective, context, thoughts. Different classmates and now lawyers argue things differently. So then I realized that the law, while many believe is black and white, can be argued differently using the same facts and thus creating a lot of gray areas. Then after a few years, I entered seminary where I pursued a master's in divinity to be a pastor. There again, there was an understanding that the theories and concepts that I learned had to be applied contextually. So it was not a one-size-fits-all. And finally, I pursued my doctoral studies, turned my PhD this month, where I was encouraged to employ a critical lens in viewing church and society. Not because I just want to be critical and point things out that are unjust, but because in naming injustices, we can work towards justice. And being critical of church, Christianity, society, for example, we can help it live up to its calling, to be a just place for all. The second context I want to share with you all that influenced me in my reliance on Mujerista theology and thereafter the construction of Mujerista Aliviar ethics is that I came from a matriarchal family. My maternal grandmother was the first to come to the US from Bolivia with one of my aunts. Then she brought my other aunts, my parents, my siblings, my cousins, and so on. I grew up since the age of 3, seeing my grandmother, aunt, and mother struggle, luchar, to bring our family out of dire economic situations into a comfortable socioeconomic stability. My father certainly worked 3 jobs most of the time before he retired. But it was my mother who managed our finances. She's the one who managed to somehow get myself and my siblings through college and grad school, somehow was able to get us from renters to buying a home, etc. However, to this day, we have never left our Latina immigrant community, whether it is through service in our migrant church where I'm the senior pastor, or through service in my vocation as a lawyer working with immigrant youth, or as a teacher where I hope to serve in diverse spaces. Given all that I have achieved, I've always found myself in a position to help others. Many in my community would always come to me seeing that I made it. And so somehow I had knowledge, I had experience that they wanted me to share. It always seemed like a one-way road. And so there was always a little bit of distance that I felt. And it always made me uneasy, especially when I entered theological studies, which says that we are all equal in the kingdom of God. Yet my privileges seemed to have separated me from those I wanted to serve. I felt that because of my privileges, I was limited. In this book, Isasi-Diaz shares how she did a missions to Peru. She was working with the poor there. She lived with them day in and day out and performed the same tasks that they did. On one occasion, she shares that one of the community members told her, "Remember, you can always leave this place, but we can't." And how that made her realize that the goal is not to be poor, but which is an impossibility, but to be in solidarity with them. We will talk about solidarity and what that means in a few minutes. But for me, sharing this story or reading this story from Isasi-Diaz allowed me to realize that my privileges don't have to be a limitation. And that if instead I can use them to be in solidarity with those I walk with. And so a little bit about some aspects of Mujerista theology. Again, this is not meant to be a thorough review, as it's impossible in one lecture and 1 hour, but it's meant to give some insight and hope, and which I hope will connect to the construction of my Mujerista Aliviar ethics that I will share with you in a few minutes. Before starting, I must share how and why I use the word Latina. I choose to use the word Latina to speak of my community of accountability. I choose to use the term Latina instead of other identifiers like Hispanic or Hispana, understanding that Latina is not a monolith and that no one is qualified to speak for all. I prefer not to use the word Hispanic, as Isasi-Diaz did in her Mujerista work, which was a contemporary term, because for me, that term is coined by federal bureaucrats in the mid-1970s to group people together of diverse cultural and historical backgrounds who have some connection to the Spanish cultural diaspora. And thus, it's a name imposed on us. Historian Daisy Machado argues that the US has always been fixated on creating a common culture and on melting people together ever since it embraced the ideology of manifest destiny. An ideology where the white Anglo was considered a superior race above all others, and it was done so in part through the use of Christianity by European colonizers. So while I recognize Latinas are diverse and multi-layered in my construction of Mujerista Aliviar ethics, I recognize that we are all different and we have certain particularities, but I also recognize how our differences and particularities are relational, meaning not in isolation, but held in community. And for me, it is my community of accountability. I choose that my community of accountability be the Latina in the US. Okay, now we'll move on to Mujerista theology. First, a little note about Ada Maria Isasi-Diaz, who's the principal founder of Mujerista theology, which is a theology that continues to evolve by Latinas, Hispanic women who are, quote, committed to the struggle for liberation. Isasi-Diaz was born in Cuba and migrated to the US as a teenager. She learned here that she was within a social cultural group called Hispanics. She was a devoted Catholic, and in the mid-1970s, she began to struggle against the sexism within the Catholic Church. And so she worked with a feminist group towards the equality of all women. However, in that group, mainly consisting of white women, she found that it was hard to find space to argue how Hispanic women struggled differently than white women. Isasi-Diaz saw the need to highlight how Hispanic women struggled differently than white women in the fight for equality. In 1992, Isasi-Diaz published an article called Roundtable Discussion, Mujeristas, Who We Are and What We Are, in which Isasi-Diaz conversed with other contemporary Latina theologians and practitioners to decide what they will call themselves. Naming themselves for Isasi-Diaz is, quote, our attempt to name ourselves is an essential strategy in developing the moral agency of Hispanic women and is therefore timely and even urgent, end quote. After much deliberation, Mujerista was the name they chose. And they defined Mujerista as, quote, a Hispanic woman who struggles to liberate herself, not as an individual, but as a member of a Hispanic community. She is one who builds bridges among Hispanics instead of falling into syncretism and using divisive tactics. A mujerista understands that her task is to gather the hopes and expectations of her people about justice and peace. In the mujerista, God chooses to once again lay claims to and revindicate the divine image and likeness of women made visible from the very beginning in the person of Eve. The mujerista is called to work for the common good, knowing that such work requires us to denounce destructive self-abnegation, end quote. Mujerista theology centers on what has been ignored or at the very least devalued in society and church, which is the everyday experience of Latinas and their knowledge. Thus, Mujerista theology privileges lo cotidiano, or the ordinary life of Latina women in context, as a source of knowledge to do theology. Mujerista theology is not the only theology that centers on lo cotidiano, as other Latina feminist theories also employ this methodology, but Mujerista does focus particularly on the US Hispanic Latina grassroots woman's experience. This focus is not because the Latina is better, is more honest, is more deserving. Instead, it is because the kingdom of God seeks justice for all here and now into eternity. And while there are marginalized and oppressed groups that exist in church and society, we must pursue justice for them. Mujerista theology does this by focusing on the Latina grassroots woman's struggle for liberation. And so I will share now a final aspect of Mujerista theology that was significant to my research, which is solidarity. In Mujerista theoethics, we recognize that each individual is part of a community and thus accountable to communal truths. In the communal context, solidarity entails, as Isasi-Diaz puts it, recognizing, quote, a union of kindred persons arising from the common responsibilities and interests, as between classes, people, or groups, community of interests, feelings, purposes, or actions, social cohesion. Solidarity moves us away from the false notion of disinterest, end quote. In other words, we are all interconnected and thus we have shared responsibilities. For example, I have to care about how my actions in spending or voting impacts other Latinas because in the end, as a Latina, my action impacts our liberation. With that, let me go on to the brief description of my dissertation. The construction of Mujerista Aliviar ethics was one of my findings during my PhD dissertation, in which I looked at mid-19th century and early 20th century Protestant missions to the Mexican community in the southwestern region territory following the U.S. conquering of those lands in 1848, and the Puerto Rican community, specifically those on the island, which were colonized by the U.S. in 1898, and how Protestant missions went there to make the people and the lands Christian by Americanizing them into the socio-political religious context and understanding of European Anglo-colonizers who deemed themselves superior and saviors to the Mexican and Puerto Rican people, who were caricatured as savage, heathen, and native. Next year, I hope to work on publishing my dissertation into a book, and when available, you'll be able to read all about the other findings. Until then, and for the purposes of this presentation, I want to talk about the final finding, the construction of Mujerista Aliviar ethics, to help process how resistance to constructed historical caricatures of Latinas in society and church is a complex dynamic, and how in processing, we can resist oppression, but also participate in it. As we process our identity as Latinas in the US, we are hit with the constructed US social, political, religious hegemonic caricature that has persisted for at least, or since at least, the colonization of Mexican and Puerto Rican lands. Primarily, these caricatures situate Latinas below the superior American Christian Anglo identity that was in place at least in the early 19th century, and at the present arguably has transformed into the ideology of US white Christian nationalism. Mujerista theology aims to provide Latinas with conscientization of how the U.S. hegemonic systems and structures oppress the Latina so that the Latina no longer participates in it and can be liberated from it. So the Latina can exercise her agency to decide who she is and how she relates. When I first learned about this in seminary in 2018, I was fascinated with it. And so I used my best efforts to see how I was participating in oppression and then try to stop participating in it. However, I found it to be a true struggle. And at many times, I found that I was failing. I would ask myself eventually, how did I even get to law school, seminary, or doctoral studies, if not by some participation in hegemonic thinking, valuing systems, or for lack of better words, assimilating? In Mujerista theology, Isasi-Diaz calls the grassroots woman the organic theologian because of their lived experience in la lucha for an abundant life. The theoethical decisions they make on a daily basis inform us about God in ways that books or theories cannot always do. That is not to say that we don't need history or tradition, but it is to say that the use of history and tradition must be in a critical way that questions injustices and then assists Latinas to be liberated. Now I would like to share one example from my dissertation, primarily from the research I did in the United Methodist Women's Home Missionary Society archives during this time period to tease out a little bit more of how I argue resistance is not always obvious to non-Latinas, and also how it is not always clear that Latinas' actions against oppression are completely and solely against oppression versus also participating in it. In this short excerpt from a 1939 missionary letter, it references an account of Miss Nieves, a Puerto Rican woman who is said to be struggling to provide for her children, and who thus agreed that her daughter, Norma, attend this missionary school because Norma would be better off in the school. The mission school offers her daughter, the letter states, as written by the missionary, big, clean schoolrooms where her mind is absorbing new ideas, songs, stories, and gaining concepts of right living, where her body has a chance to play and exercise in safe, wholesome surroundings, and where she knows that every effort will be made on the part of the teachers and the ministers of the church to start them in the Christian way of living. The way the missionary writes this story makes it unimaginable for the reader to conclude anything but that Miss Nieves' daughter would benefit from such a school, and implies that the school far exceeds any Puerto Rican school. The short excerpt of this missionary letter portrays U.S. mission schools as morally good because they are big, clean, they bring new ideas, songs, stories, and the right living concepts, which is the Christian way of living. One is led to infer that Puerto Ricans have small, dirty schools where children are taught wrong ideas, songs, and stories, and the incorrect way to lead a Christian life. Such a bifurcated moral conceptualization and racial classification creates binaries and hierarchies. A decolonial critical framework raises the question of whether something else could be driving Ms. Nieves' desire for her daughter to participate in mission schools. Note, for example, that some of the school graduates return to work there in exchange for their room and board. If the prospect of a job with room and board is available to those who attend this educational mission school enterprise of American Christianity, is opting for it really a sign of valuing educational system and its teaching, or a way of survival in an economically precarious time? Or could it be both? The decision to enter a mission school might appear simple to the U.S. missionary who wrote this letter, but surely it is a more complex decision for Puerto Rican girls. Puerto Rican girls could reasonably recognize that they will not attend Spanish-speaking Puerto Rican schools like their peers, but rather an American school where they will be taught American subjects in English. Whether they desire such identity formation or not, it may lead to job prospects upon graduation, which can secure them food and housing that they need to survive. So I asked myself, could young Puerto Rican girls assimilate to ensure economic viability and not necessarily a desire to assimilate? Or perhaps they do desire economic viability and they desire to assimilate, understanding both of which open doors in a US socioeconomic structure. I guess what I'm really asking is, can one be oppressed and participate in the oppressing? Can one resist and be part of the oppressive structure? To answer these questions, I consider a complex oppress-oppressor dynamics, demonstrating that it is possible for privilege, complicity, oppression, and resistance to coexist in the messiness of reality, in the in-between transitional spaces and places. With this understanding of the complexity of resistance, where it is not always so easy to identify oppressive structures and then stop participating in them, or as decolonial scholars call it, detaching from it, I constructed Mujerista Aliviar ethics as a way to understand Latinas' agency as we seek liberation amid oppressive structures, systems, and ideologies. As we seek justice here and now, I posit we do so aliviando, which entails unbinding ourselves from histories that devalue Latinas' worth using Mujerista conscientization process and Mi Conciencia Dice. To unbind oneself from the worldview of US superiority is unimaginable, given the stronghold on politics, governance, economics, religion, etc. for centuries. The virtues of godliness, allegedly innate to the US, further solidifies the stronghold, making it almost impossible to see anything wrong with the everyday life of a person living in the US. To be a US American in the global context outside the US has many benefits, proliferated by the American superiority narrative. Those communities who are oppressed or stigmatized as other are usually bound as they seek to assimilate in an effort to be found worthy and to be valued as equals. That being said, this is not to say that all others are on equal footing, simply because they are non-Anglo or non-white. Nonetheless, to unbind would mean preliminarily to question the desire to be American, with American in an ideology of superiority, and thus to reimagine a different worldview, a different way of determining worth and value. As Isasi-Diaz says, quote, a new symbolic order. In other words, to unbind means to not center US superior worldviews. The unbinding process for Mujerista Aliviar ethics can initiate with what Mujerista theology calls conscientization, an ongoing process of critical reflection on action that leads to critical awareness to spark a person to action. These critical actions of self-determination, I argue, can be initiated by what Isasi-Diaz calls Mi Conciencia Me Dice, my conscience tells me, which Isasi-Diaz says, quote, is a phrase often heard among Hispanic women, appealing to one's consciousness in regular conversation, in discussion, and even arguments of small consequence. It is not unusual for us, end quote. Thus, in Mujerista Aliviar ethics, there is a push for us to listen to Mi Conciencia in our daily lived experience in such a manner that it can spark us to unbind that which oppresses us, even if the unbinding includes strategically employing the colonizer's tools and the colonizer's religious language to do so. Unbinding does not require one to quit participating in oppression. To the contrary, one can still participate strategically in order to unbind and loosen other shackles. This unbinding process is a coiled process, as it can be circular and it can stretch forward or recoil backwards and then forward and backwards again like a spring. And thus, it has no endpoint and remains in perpetuity because self-identity and self-determination are continuous and lifelong processes. Further, the unbinding process can at times lead to rebinding due to the processes that occur in the next phase of Mujerista Aliviar ethics, which is healing, specifically healing from the histories that bind. Once we pull back the bandages, once we loosen the shackles and recognize that part of us or all of us has been erased, deceived, fractured and or despised, then we are required to heal. Chicanas, those of Mexican American heritage in the movement for transformation, recognize that in the process of unbinding and healing, there can be fragmentation, incompleteness, ambiguity, in-betweenness, and living in transitory realities. While this way of existing can seem perilous to and destructive to the dominant person who operates under the illusion of completeness or wholeness, it can be a source of strength for Chicanas and Latinas. Chicanas have said, for many of them, quote, time and again, memory rather than history nurtures a spiritual mestizaje, attentive to the constraints of nation, race, norms of gender and sexuality, end quote. Remembering stories that affirm their pain in the binding and that affirm that which is unbound is a way of creating counter memories of who they say they are and how they relate to themselves, others, and the spiritual. This aspect of Chicana studies, and other Latina feminists as well, and also included partially in Mujerista studies, is incorporated into Mujerista Aliviar ethics, grounded on the need for healing via counter narratives that are life-giving to Latinas. Remembering counter narratives is a practice meant to be shared in community, in particular in a community of accountability, because outside of that, there is a risk that it might be read with the intention of capitalist publishing enterprise that reproduce the desire to exotify the other. As Mujerista theology affirms, Latinas are not in isolation, but a community. Thus, there is an element of community in the process of healing. However, healing an identity in a community that rejects such identity can be harmful, for example, queerness. Consequently, differences within a community should be points of relation, where we seek to relate from different points instead of being bound by categories. Mujerista theology posits, quote, embracing differences as a moral option, end quote, where differences is plural, requiring us to embrace ambiguity, but not total relativity. For because Mujerista theology, quote, is a strategy for liberation, there is a certain discipline of action that we demand of each other, end quote. Thus, it is crucial to recognize the diversity in the unbinding and healing processes, as well as in the recoiling of these processes. With that in mind, I present the final ongoing process of Mujerista Aliviar ethics in the complex dynamics of the oppressor, which is liberation. Liberation for Isasi-Diaz is a two-pronged practice in Mujerista theology. The first prong is to work, quote, to enable Latinas to understand the many oppressive structures that almost completely determine our daily lives, end quote, and not participate in those. The second prong is to aid Latinas in defining their, quote, preferred future. What would a radically different society look like? What will be its values and norms, end quote. In Mujerista Aliviar ethics, the recognition of systems and structures that determine our lives entails recognizing what binds us, and thereafter deciding whether we are ready to unbind from them. Thus, where I stretch Mujerista theology is in arguing that participation in such binding oppression, once recognized, is sometimes permissible and even warranted for healing and liberation. We do not have to always recognize oppression and then make a hard stop to participating in it. Sometimes when we unbind, it is too hard to initiate healing, and so we bind ourselves again, even to something or someone ultimately destructive. Sometimes when we are undergoing the process of healing, it becomes too much, so we bind again and then unbind and heal and so on. At other times, we unbind in one area, but are still bound in other areas. And because we cannot unbind all at once, we sometimes need to let the recognized bind, say the oppressor of some kind, remain, and thus we continue to participate in the remaining bound. In other words, we liberate and resist in some areas while we continue to participate in binding oppression in others. However, we must be cautious that our rebinding is not done so as an excuse for tolerating the status quo, especially when it prevents us from being in solidarity. In this, Mujerista Aliviar ethics, the liberation process, lets Latinas decide for themselves who they are and how they relate to others and how they relate to the spiritual or divine. None of us can claim to be free of dominant thinking. Nonetheless, in that, we still find ways to liberate ourselves. As Isasi-Diaz says, quote, whatever we find valuable to achieve our goal, end quote, a freeing of ourselves is necessary. Thus, this struggle for liberation comes from the struggle of dancing with creativity, meaning that in struggle, we must find creative knowledge, methods, strategies, and practices to process and practice liberation. The struggle for liberation demands that Latinas imagine a new way of existing beyond the constraints of dominant society and religion. Lastly, Mujerista Aliviar ethics entails recognition of how I have many bindings, some that I unbind, some that I choose to remain bound, and some that I do not yet see. And so how do I choose not to center some bindings over others? In other words, and I hope that you guys can help me answer this in our Q&A, how do I choose not to center my oppression in one way and ignore how I participate in oppression in other ways? Let me repeat that question. How do I choose not to center my oppression in one way and ignore how I participate in oppression in other ways? To decenter self is not to center others, but to step back and enter into a space of neutrality, of giving and receiving, of listening, so that together we can reimagine a new symbolic order in church and society. Thank you.